It was a stormy Friday night. The kind where chaos ruled the emergency room. The waiting area buzzed with noise, phones ringing, families whispering anxiously, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. In the midst of it all, Dr. Alex Carter, a tall and composed man in his mid-30s, strode through the halls in his crisp white coat. His presence was magnetic, exuding calm authority with every step, even as patients were wheeled in and nurses dashed past. Then came Officer Sam Lewis, a tall, stocky cop with a scowl plastered on his face. He entered the ER carrying a young suspect with bloodied hands. Officer Lewis' uniform was soaked, his mood foul, and his voice sharp. "Hey, where's the doctor? We've got a situation," he barked. Dr. Carter was used to chaos. He turned toward the commotion, ready to take charge, but as his eyes met the officer's, something about the way Lewis' gaze hardened, almost challenging, made the air shift. "Sir," Alex said calmly, "I'm Dr. Carter. What's going on with the patient?" Officer Lewis' lips curled as he gave Alex an exaggerated once-over. From the neatly styled hair to the name badge pinned to his white coat. He let out a bitter chuckle. "You're the doctor?" Lewis said, disbelief dripping from every word. "Aren't you a little underqualified for this?" Alex paused, the words cutting through the noise. A cold tension settled into the room as nurses and patients nearby glanced up, silently aware of what had just been implied. But Alex didn't blink. Instead, he lifted his head, his voice steady but curious. "And what makes you say that, Officer Lewis?" The moment hung thick in the air. Officer Lewis' question echoed like a sharp slap. But Dr. Alex Carter held his composure, his expression unreadable. Lewis adjusted his grip on the young man he had in custody. "Still bleeding slightly but conscious." "Just saying," he muttered, a smirk creeping onto his face. "You don't look like the kind of guy running the show around here." "Thought I was looking for someone a little different." "You sure you're not just an orderly?" A few nurses froze mid-step, and a security guard near the entrance tilted his head, clearly registering the insult. The room seemed to inhale collectively, waiting for Dr. Carter's response. Alex looked Lewis squarely in the eye, calm and measured, like he was assessing a patient instead of the man in front of him. "I can assure you, officer, I'm very much the doctor in charge here. I've got a residency at one of the top hospitals in the country. More experience than I can count. And oh," he gestured toward his badge, "the name, doctor, isn't there by accident." The response was clean and professional. But Lewis wasn't finished. His smirk turned into a full sneer. "Yeah, well, fancy degrees don't mean much when you've got criminals like this guy." He shook the suspect roughly, causing him to bleed all over the floor. "You sure you can handle this, Doc? Or do we need someone who actually knows what they're doing?" A low murmur rolled through the room. A young nurse beside Alex frowned, whispering under her breath, "Unbelievable." But Alex didn't lose his cool. Not a muscle twitched in his face. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, an almost amused look creeping into his eyes. "I'll take care of your suspect, officer," he replied firmly. "But while I'm doing my job, you might want to take a seat." He gestured toward the waiting area, his tone polite yet unmistakably dismissive. Lewis blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me? You seem tired," Alex said smoothly. "Maybe a break will give you some perspective." Lewis opened his mouth to argue, but Alex turned toward the injured suspect with such precision and focus that the cop was momentarily rendered speechless. "Irrelevant. Get him on a gurney," Dr. Alex Carter told the nearby staff. "Latoya, make sure he's stable." Alex's composure was unshakable, but as the officers muttered among themselves, it was clear Officer Sam Lewis wasn't done yet. The tension hadn't broken, it had simply shifted. And everyone knew Officer Lewis wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide. The young suspect was wheeled into a treatment bay, his groans of pain drowned out by the hum of activity in the ER. Dr. Carter washed his hands at the sink, the water running hot over his palms. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Officer Lewis leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching him with a smug, silent challenge. The cop wasn't hiding his intent anymore. He didn't trust Alex, not his skills, not his authority, and definitely not his right to be there. Alex dried his hands, unbothered by Lewis' scrutiny, but he could feel the heat of the moment building like pressure behind a dam. He stepped up to the patient, calm and focused. "What's your name?" Alex asked the young man softly. pulling on his gloves. Marcus, the boy muttered, barely meeting his eyes. He was maybe 19, thin, with a bruise blooming on his temple. You're going to be fine. Marcus, just let me do my job. Officer Lewis stepped forward, his heavy boots loud against the floor. Don't bother making friends, Doc. He's a repeat offender. A waste of time if you ask me. Alex didn't even glance up as he examined Marcus's injury. I didn't ask you. Lewis scoffed, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. You doctors love wasting time on thugs like him. Huh? Figures. That was it. The silence that followed was sharp. The air thick. One of the nurses paused mid-task, her eyes darting between the two men. A tech behind them quietly stepped out of the room. Everyone felt the weight of what Lewis had just said. Dr. Carter stopped what he was doing. Slowly, he stood up straight, turning to face Lewis. His gaze wasn't angry, it was sharp, thoughtful, and unyielding, as though he was peering right through the officer. Officer Lewis, Alex began, his voice cool and deliberate. I'm curious, what exactly do you think my job is? Lewis frowned. Your job? To patch up lowlifes like him. Apparently. Alex took a step closer, his white coat seeming to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights. My job is to save lives. Lives, all lives, whether they're saints, sinners, police officers, or kids who made mistakes. I'm not here to decide who's worthy. I'm here to do my job, something you, as an officer of the law, should understand. Lewis' face turned a shade redder. But before he could respond, Alex leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Tell me, officer, when you signed up for your job, did you get to pick and choose who deserved your protection? Lewis stared at him, silent, as if he hadn't expected to be questioned. That's what I thought, Alex said softly. Then, in one smooth motion, he turned back to Marcus. LaToya, let's get you stitched up. The words were so calm and precise that they hit harder than any outburst could have. For the first time, Lewis looked unsure, his bravado faltering as Alex resumed his work. The nurses exchanged knowing glances. A subtle shift in the room's energy as everyone returned to their duties. But as Lewis backed against the wall, his glare hardened again. It was clear he wasn't going to let Dr. Carter's quiet strength have the last word. Not yet. The steady rhythm of beeping monitors filled the room as Dr. Carter meticulously stitched Marcus's wound. Every movement was calm and deliberate, as if the earlier exchange hadn't happened at all. But the tension remained heavy, coiling tighter with each second. Officer Lewis stood in the corner, arms crossed, his glare practically boring a hole into Alex's back. Nurses moved through the bay quietly, their steps cautious, avoiding Lewis' line of sight. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't over. Hold still, Marcus, Alex said, his voice steady as he carefully closed the last stitch. Marcus winced but nodded, his breathing slowing. You're good at this, Doc, Marcus muttered, his voice hoarse but sincere. It was a small gesture of gratitude, but it was enough to make Lewis a short, mocking laugh barked out from Officer Sam Lewis. Dr. Alex Carter didn't flinch, but he could feel Lewis looming closer, now standing just feet away. Doc, ha, Lewis sneered, his voice cutting through the quiet. Kid's grateful for once. I'll give him that. Guess he doesn't know how lucky he is to get special treatment. Alex set his tools down deliberately, turning his head just enough to look Lewis in the eye. Special treatment? Yeah, Lewis replied, his tone sharper now, as if pushing harder would regain his sense of control. You know what I'm talking about. People like him. He jabbed a finger toward Marcus. And people like you getting handouts. Getting a pass when you shouldn't. For the first time, Marcus looked up, confusion and shame flashing across his face. A nurse gasped softly, and the low hum of voices in nearby bays quieted again, as if Lewis' words had sliced through the entire But Dr. Carter remained still, his face unreadable. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. He simply turned fully toward Lewis, standing tall, his white coat impeccable, the authority in his presence undeniable. People like me, Alex repeated softly, as if testing the words. His calmness was unnerving, sharper than anger could ever be. Tell me, officer, what exactly do you think people like me are? Lewis faltered for half a second, but he recovered quickly. Oh, don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean. It's just. Alex held up his hand, silencing him with a single, confident gesture. Let me tell you what people like me are. Officer Lewis. Alex's voice was firm, Steady. Each word perfectly articulated. We're the ones who earn our place. Every inch, every step, through late nights, through years of schooling, through every doubt and every dismissive look from people like you. We show up, we do the work, and we don't need your permission to exist in these spaces. Lewis opened his mouth to interrupt. But Alex wasn't finished. His voice grew stronger, cutting through the silence like a blade. People like me are doctors because we earned it. Because we chose to rise when others doubted us. Because we chose to help. Help everyone, even those who can't see past their own prejudice. And you, Officer Lewis. Alex tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. You're just another obstacle we will move past. Just like all the others. For the first time that night, Officer Lewis had no immediate response. He stood frozen, his face flushed red, his confidence visibly shaken. Marcus stared at Alex, eyes wide, awe replacing the shame he'd felt moments earlier. Even the nurses nearby stopped pretending to busy themselves, glancing at Alex with quiet respect. But Lewis, despite the cracks showing in his bravado, wasn't ready to back down. He pointed a finger at Marcus and muttered, "You're still wasting your time on this one. Doc, he'll be back in here next week. I guarantee it." Alex didn't miss a beat. He glanced at Marcus and then back at Lewis, his calm expression suddenly shifting just slightly to something sharp. Something knowing. "We'll see about that," he said. "Maybe this is the night that changes everything." Lewis frowned, thrown by the certainty in Alex's voice. He opened his mouth as if to argue again. But then, "Dr. Carter," a nurse's voice called from the other side of the cutting through the tension. "We've got a trauma case coming in. They're asking for you." Alex nodded once and turned back to Marcus. "You'll be fine," he said gently before stepping away to handle the new emergency. As he walked past Lewis, he didn't even look at him. He didn't have to, because Officer Lewis had been left standing there. His authority chipped, his words exposed for the hollow threat they were. Things were as they were. But the storm wasn't over yet. Dr. Alex Carter knew that much. Some people couldn't let go of their need to dominate, to belittle, to hold others down. And something in Officer Sam Lewis' glare as Alex passed told him this wasn't finished. The double doors to the trauma bay swung open, and Dr. Carter strode in, his mind shifting gears to focus on the new emergency. A car accident victim lay on the gurney, unconscious and bleeding heavily, surrounded by a frantic team of nurses and techs. "Vitals?" Alex asked sharply, pulling on fresh gloves. "BP dropping fast. 80/50. A nurse replied. "We're looking at internal bleeding. He's tacky." Alex moved quickly, issuing clear, rapid instructions to stabilize the patient. In the controlled chaos of the trauma bay, his leadership was absolute, calm, decisive, unflinching. To his team, he was not just a doctor, he was the doctor. The person they trusted to pull this patient back from the brink. But as the patient's vitals slowly stabilized under Alex's care, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. Officer Lewis. Alex didn't react outwardly, but he couldn't help the flicker of irritation that sparked inside him. Lewis was standing just beyond the glass partition, arms still crossed, eyes fixed on him like a hawk. He hadn't moved from the What is he still doing here? The patient's condition stabilized enough for surgery prep, and Alex peeled off his gloves as he stepped back. He turned toward the nurse. "Get them up to OR-2. Tell them we'll need a surgical team ready in 10. "Yes, doctor." Alex took a deep breath and turned on his heel, heading out of the trauma bay and straight toward Lewis. "Officer Lewis," he said evenly, his tone professional but tinged with steel. "Is there something I can help you with?" Lewis smirked as though he'd been waiting for this moment. "Just keeping an eye on things, doctor. Making sure everything's in order." "Everything is in order," Alex replied without missing a beat. "Unless you've suddenly been appointed hospital administration. I think you're out of your jurisdiction." The words were pointed, but Lewis didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low and insistent. "You think you're real clever, don't you? Talking down to me like that back there." Alex remained still, his posture straight, his face unreadable. "If you're looking for a fight, officer, you're wasting your time. I have lives to save. You, on the other hand, seem to have nowhere else to be." Lewis' face turned red again, but his voice stayed cold. "You think just because you've got a fancy title and a coat, you're better than me. I see right through you. You're arrogant. You think you don't have to answer to anyone." Alex's jaw tightened, but his voice remained composed. I answer to my patients. Officer. I answer to the people who trust me to save their lives. People who need me. That's what I care about. Lewis took another step forward. His eyes narrowed dangerously. What happens when you screw up? Huh? When one of those people you care about dies on your watch. You still going to act like you're untouchable? The implication hit hard, sharper than Lewis' usual barbs. Alex's expression flickered just slightly. And Lewis noticed it. Don't like hearing that, do you? Lewis said, his voice cruel now. Not so perfect after all. Huh? Alex exhaled slowly through his nose, keeping his temper in check. He knew what Lewis was doing. Trying to provoke him. Trying to drag him down into an argument he couldn't win. And that's when Alex's sharp intellect kicked in. He took a step closer, now matching Lewis' intensity. You're right about one thing. Officer Lewis, Dr. Alex Carter said, his voice even but deliberate. I'm not perfect. No doctor is. And you know what? I can live with that. I can accept that I'll make mistakes because I'm human. But I'll never make the mistake of letting hate and ignorance guide my actions. Lewis blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Alex straightened, his voice growing stronger. I don't have to prove anything to you. My work speaks for itself. But you've spent the entire night trying to prove something to me. So maybe ask yourself why that is. Lewis' mouth opened as if to reply, but no words came out. For the first time, Alex saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, just a flicker. But it was enough. Before Lewis could recover, Alex stepped back, his expression composed once more. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients to see. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Officer Lewis standing there speechless, surrounded by the quiet hum of the But Alex knew this wasn't over. Lewis' pride wouldn't let it be. Men like him didn't back down, not without pushing even harder first. The air continued to hum with its usual rhythm, but under the surface, a tension lingered like a low-pressure storm about to break. Dr. Carter moved from one patient to the next, his focus sharp, his composure unshaken, at least on the outside. But Lewis' presence still gnawed at the edge of his thoughts. Every time he passed the waiting area, there he was, Officer Sam Lewis, standing rigid and watchful as if he were waiting for Alex to make a misstep. Why was he still here? Alex tried not to let it bother him. He had always been a man of patience and principle, believing that actions spoke louder than insults or prejudice. But the longer Lewis loitered in the glaring at every move Alex made, the harder it was to ignore. It all came to a head when the charge nurse, Linda, approached Alex at the nurse's station. Linda was an older woman, experienced and tough, but even she seemed rattled. Dr. Carter, she said softly, glancing over her shoulder where Lewis stood by the entrance. I think you should know. Officer Lewis has been making some remarks about you. Alex sighed but didn't look surprised. What kind of remarks? Linda hesitated, her voice dropping lower. He's been saying things to the staff, questioning your credentials, asking if you're really qualified to lead this tonight. A few techs are already on edge because of him. Alex's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained calm. Is that so? Linda nodded. He's stirring things up. Doctor, it's not right. You want me to call hospital security? Alex shook his head. No, Linda, not yet. I'll handle it. The nurse looked at him doubtfully, but she trusted him. Just be careful. He's got a chip on his shoulder the size of this hospital. Alex offered her a small nod and headed toward Lewis. The officer was standing near the waiting area, arms crossed, openly glaring at him as he approached. Officer Lewis, Alex began firmly, stopping just a few feet away. His tone was polite but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. I've been told you're questioning my qualifications. Is that true? Lewis smirked as if he'd been waiting for this. What, you think people don't have a right to ask questions? I'm just looking out for everyone here. Doc, making sure things are done right. Alex stepped closer, his gaze unyielding. You've been here for hours. Officer, you followed me, insulted me, and now you're undermining me to my staff. Tell me, what exactly is your goal here? Lewis didn't flinch. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Maybe you're in over your head. Maybe someone else should be running this show tonight. The words were calculated, meant to provoke. Alex felt the anger ripple through him like a spark threatening to catch fire. But he didn't let it show. Instead, he drew a slow, steady breath and leaned in just enough to meet Lewis' gaze head on. Listen to me carefully, Officer Lewis, he said, his voice low but cutting through the noise like a scalpel. You are not a doctor. You have no say in what happens in this And no matter how many insults you throw at me, you will not shake my confidence nor my ability to do my job. Alex said, his voice unwavering. Officer Lewis sneered, but Alex didn't stop. His words grew sharper. You've been standing here for hours trying to challenge me. And for what? To make yourself feel powerful? To soothe whatever insecurity you're carrying around? You came here with a suspect in need of care. I gave that care. No questions asked. Now you're harassing my staff and distracting me from my patients. And if you think I'll let that slide, think again. Lewis' smirk faltered. His posture stiffened as if the words had struck him harder than he expected. You're out of line, Lewis said, his voice quieter now but still holding on to a thread of authority. No, Officer Lewis, Alex replied evenly. You are. For a moment, neither man spoke. The nurses nearby watched in silent awe as Dr. Carter held his ground. Lewis' bravado was cracking, and it showed. Finally, Alex stepped back, his voice calm but resolute. Now, you can either leave this or I'll call hospital security to escort you out. Your choice. Lewis stared at him, his jaw tight, his face red with anger and embarrassment. For a second, it seemed like he might push further. But then he turned abruptly and stomped toward the doors. The tension finally broke as Lewis disappeared through the exit, leaving behind a stunned silence. Linda approached Alex, her face breaking into a rare smile. Well, I haven't seen anyone stand up to that guy like that. Alex exhaled quietly, his composure finally easing. I just did what needed to be done. Linda chuckled. Remind me never to get on your bad side, Dr. Carter. But as Alex looked back toward the double doors, he knew it wasn't over. Officer Lewis might have left the for now, but men like him always found ways to come back, and Alex would be ready when he did. Outside the the storm had picked up, rain hammering against the glass windows and reflecting the harsh glow of emergency lights. Dr. Alex Carter finally allowed himself a moment of quiet in his small office. He sat at his desk, reviewing charts and stabilizing his breath. Confronting Officer Lewis had been necessary, but it still left a sour taste in his mouth. Men like him don't back down. Alex knew that prejudice was not a problem solved with a single conversation or a firm tone. It persisted, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to strike again, and tonight felt like just the beginning of something worse. The knock at the door startled him. It was Linda, the charge nurse, her face tight with concern. Doctor, you need to come out here, she said hurriedly. Alex rose immediately. What's happened? It's Lewis. He's back, she said grimly, and he brought someone with him. Alex's stomach tightened, but he forced his face to remain neutral. Let's go. When Alex stepped back into the his eyes locked on the scene unfolding near the main doors. Officer Sam Lewis was back, as Linda had said, and he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was his partner, a tall, wiry officer with narrowed eyes and a hand casually resting on his belt. There he is, Lewis said loudly, pointing straight at Alex. Heads turned, patients, nurses, and techs all froze as the focus of the room shifted. This is the guy the first told you about. Alex frowned, stepping forward with his usual calm authority. What exactly is happening here? Officer Lewis? Lewis' partner spoke first, his voice cooler, measured. We got a report that you were unprofessional. Dr. Carter, Officer Lewis here says you obstructed his ability to do his job and disrespected him in front of witnesses. The words hung heavy in the air. Alex felt the anger in his chest coiled tight, but he refused to let it show. Around him, nurses and staff began whispering to each other, their faces a mix of shock and indignation. Excuse me? Alex said, his voice edged with steel. That's an outright lie. Lewis grinned, the triumph evident in his expression. You think you're untouchable, Doc? You're not. You embarrassed me tonight. People like you think you can walk all over the rest of us. But I'm not letting that slide. People like me, Alex repeated softly. We're back to that again? Lewis' partner raised a hand, his tone forced into neutrality. Enough. We don't need this turning into a scene. He turned to Alex, his expression unreadable. We're going to need to file a report about this incident. Doctor, hospital administration will need to be informed. Alex's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes on him, waiting, watching. The had ground to a halt, He glanced around, locking eyes with his staff, Linda, the younger nurses, the techs, people who trusted him, who had worked beside him for years. He saw Marcus, the young man Louis had dragged in earlier, sitting quietly in a corner, his expression full of worry. Alex took a slow breath, pulling himself up to his full height. "You want to file a report?" he asked, his voice calm yet powerful. "Fine, but let's make sure it's the right report." Louis snorted. "Oh, what's that supposed to mean?" Alex turned his gaze to Linda. "Linda, please call hospital security. Inform them we have officers interfering with hospital operations." Louis' smug grin faltered. "What are you doing?" "I'm following protocol." Alex replied sharply. "This is my You don't get to march in here, harass my staff, intimidate me, and lie about what happened tonight. I won't tolerate it, not from you. Not from anyone." Louis' partner looked increasingly uncomfortable. "There's no need for that. Dr. Carter, let's calm down here." "No," Alex said, his voice rising just enough to command the room's attention. "I've been calm all night. I've been respectful, but I'm done letting you throw around accusations as a weapon. This stops now." Linda nodded and picked up the phone. "Calling security as ordered." Several nurses began murmuring in quiet approval. The tide of the room was shifting. Alex turned back to Louis, locking eyes with him. "You underestimated me, Officer Louis. You thought I'd get angry. That I'd lose my composure. That I'd play into whatever image you've created in your head. But I won't, because I'm better than that. I'm better than you." Louis opened his mouth to retort. But before he could, two hospital security guards entered through the main doors. Called by Linda, they looked between Alex and the officers, clearly ready to restore order. "Is there a problem here, Dr. Carter?" one of the guards asked. Alex gestured toward Louis. "These officers are interfering with patient care and harassing hospital staff. I'm requesting they be escorted out unless they have a legitimate reason to remain." Louis' face flushed deep red, his jaw tightening as he realized the room was no longer on his side. His partner, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation, muttered, "Come on, Sam, let's go." "What?" Louis barked. "No, we're leaving." The partner insisted firmly, tugging at Louis' sleeve. "Let it go." Louis looked ready to explode, but he had no choice. With a final venomous glare at Alex, he turned and stalked toward the exit, his boots heavy against the floor. The watched in silence as the officers disappeared through the doors. When they were gone, a collective exhale seemed to fill the space. Linda turned to Alex, admiration in her voice. "You handled that perfectly, Doctor." Malcolm nodded, though the weight of the moment still lingered. "Thank you, Linda." Nearby, Marcus spoke up softly. "Hey, Doc." Malcolm turned, his expression softening as he looked at the young man. "Thanks for standing up to him. Not just for you, but for me too." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Any time." As the hum of the slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Malcolm Carter straightened his shoulders, a quiet strength in his stance. The night wasn't over. There would always be more patients to treat, more challenges to face, and people like Officer Louis? They were just noise, obstacles to move past. Because Malcolm wasn't just a doctor, he was unshakable. The slowly returned to its steady hum, a fragile calm settling over the room. Nurses moved through their tasks with renewed focus, glancing occasionally at Dr. Carter as he made his way back to the nurses' station. Though the storm Louis had created had passed, its echoes lingered like ripples in a pond. Linda joined him, her voice low but warm. "You know, Doctor, I've worked here for 20 years. And I've seen more than my share of trouble. But I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that with such grace." Malcolm gave a small smile, though he remained focused on his chart. "Grace takes practice, Linda. I've had a lot of practice." She shook her head in admiration. "That man wanted to break you down, but you stood taller instead. I think the staff and the patients won't forget that anytime soon." Malcolm finally looked up from the chart, his voice thoughtful. "The truth is, Linda, men like Louis aren't new to me. I've met them in classrooms, in boardrooms, in operating rooms, people who assume I don't belong because of the way I look, because of where I come from. And yet here you are." Linda said softly. "Here I am," Malcolm replied, a quiet confidence in his tone. "And I'll keep showing up every day. Because when someone like Officer Louis walks through those doors, I don't see an enemy, I see an opportunity." An opportunity to prove that no matter what they think, I'm not going anywhere. Linda nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. That's why you're Dr. Carter. At the far end of the waiting room, Marcus sat quietly, his gaze fixed on Malcolm. The young man had been through enough that night, hauled in by a cop who saw nothing more than a mistake. Stitched up by a doctor who saw something more. Hey, Marcus, Malcolm called. Approaching him, the boy looked up. Yes, sir? You're all set to go home. Someone coming to pick you up? Marcus shook his head. I can call someone. Malcolm sat on the bench across from him, his voice calm but firm. Look, I don't know what happened to bring you here tonight, but I'm telling you, you got a choice. You don't have to let tonight define you. Marcus looked away, his shoulders slumped. Guys like Lewis, they don't let us forget. I know, Malcolm replied softly, but guys like Lewis don't decide who you are. You do. I've been where you are, feeling like the whole world has already made up its mind about you. But you can prove them wrong. I promise you, Marcus, it's worth it. For a moment, the boy said nothing. Then finally, he looked back at Malcolm, his expression brighter, just slightly, but enough to matter. Thanks, Doc. Take care of yourself, Malcolm said with a nod. The storm outside had eased by the time Malcolm walked back to his office. His white coat still as crisp as it had been at the start of his shift. As he glanced through the window, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, washing the streets clean. He thought of Lewis, of his anger, his need to control, his refusal to see people like Malcolm as equals. Men like him always came back. But Malcolm had learned long ago that the best response to hate was success, to stand taller, work harder, and lift others up along the way. As he sat down at his desk, he let the weight of the night fall away. Another patient saved, another obstacle overcome. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Dr. Malcolm Carter would be ready.